Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Meet the Visionaries podcast hosted by MIT Center for Real Estate. My name is Cherry Tang, and I'm a first-year student in the Master of Science of Real Estate Development program at MIT. Today, we're joined by Jenna Marie Smith, an architect and urban planner whose visionary work has completely redefined how cities and fans experience baseball. She's been called a woman behind some of baseball's most hallowed halls and recognized as a pioneer of her craft by the industry. From Oriole Park in Baltimore to Fenway Park in Boston to Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, Jenna Marie's fingerprints are on some of the most beloved ballparks in the game. Over the years, she's helped create and preserve iconic venues that blend history, community, and design innovation. She now serves as the Executive Vice President of Planning and Development for LA Dodgers and is also the co-founder of Canopy Team, a women-led strategy and design firm. Jenna Marie, thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Funny enough of the timing of our interview, as of yesterday, last night, Blue Jays won the ALS and will be proceeding to the World Series championship against Dodgers. I am originally from Toronto, so I was just telling everyone back at home, I am interviewing Jenna Marie Smith, who is CVP of planning and development for the Dodgers. So it's just funny, the timing of this interview.
It is funny. Well, I love that's why I love baseball, though. It gives us a lot of little banter and things that bring us together and give us a common language, no matter what our walk of life.
Exactly. Yeah. So without further ado, I want to dive into your legendary work in real estate development and also in baseball. So let's start with Battery Park City, a 92 anchor community in Lower Manhattan in New York. Can you talk about your role on that project and what that experience taught you about designing places where people live and gather?
Well, it was my first real job after college to be the coordinator of planning and design for Battery Park City under Amanda Burden. And it was a real treat to work on this Cooper Extent plan that took the streets of Lower Manhattan, extended them out to the waterfront, developed a series of design guidelines that went beyond traditional master planning to prescribe not just the traditional uses, heights, FAR of zoning, but to also dictate street walls where arcades would embrace retail, setbacks, articulated rooftops, some things that were very subjective. But it was all about trying to make Battery Park City feel like it was part of Lower Manhattan and not just something that had been appended to it, even though in reality, the 92 acres had been just appended to it. But that has influenced my work probably more than most people realize, because when I worked for the Orioles some 10 years later on the creation of Oriole Park at Camden Yards, the knowledge of how to think about urban context and how to define it in a way that, from an owner perspective, what were the things that we were looking to achieve that would give definition to the building beyond just simply existing in an urban setting. Those were all things that I learned working for Richard Kahn and Amanda Burden at Battery Park City in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm. And afterwards, you worked in LA during the 1984 LA Olympics, and you worked on some of the adaptive reuse projects. So I was wondering if you could talk about impact of your project, the impact on downtown LA, and what was your takeaway from that experience?
Sure, and it's a good question because it sort of gives me an entree into saying how I ended up in sports, because I did not start out looking to work in sports, and even after all these years, I don't think of myself as being, quote, of sports. I still think of having 2 feet firmly rooted in urban planning. But Los Angeles is obviously, compared to New York, a city of contrast. And one of the things that I struggled with in Los Angeles was this sense of community and how to feel, I love the feeling of being alone in a crowd. The energy of New York is contagious, and it's hard to find places like that in Los Angeles unless you seek them out. And sports are one of the ways that you find that. And I sort of fell in love with baseball and the Dodgers at Dodger Stadium because of that. But because my job was to work on the renovation of a downtown urban park, that was part of the tide of focus on venues during the 1984 Olympics. I just saw the power of using existing spaces, using existing public places, the dirty designed Sussman Prasia graphic artistry that gave definition to the 84 Olympics and made all these different settings feel unified was also very powerful. So the visual of using scaffolding and these fantastic colors to define where the Olympics were being held. Again, I look back at these things and how such a positive impression changed the way I thought about a city and thought about sports in a city and thought about the way they could be used for urban revitalization.
And in terms of urban revitalization, so back in the 60s, there was a trend in the US to embrace modernization, such as building rounder stadium that could be home to both baseball and football. And I quote one of the phrases you used. You mentioned that the modern movement was not kind to architecture, architecturalism, or any of the things in American cities that often define their past. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's the mid-century modern um, architecture is really interesting, but architecture in the mid-century wasn't always so interesting. There was sort of this focus on these perfect shapes, and um, it's a form that feels almost foreign in an urban environment. Not that there aren't gyms, but sports were not immune to that. And there was this idea of doing this multi-purpose stadium that would work for football, baseball, concerts, etc. And I think planners use this movement to make those buildings public facilities. I mean, you have to sort of think back and to ground yourself in the fact that in the early 1900s, most baseball parks would have been private, an Ebbets Field, a Wrigley Field, a Fenway Park. They were not publicly funded. So when the public sector got involved, planners used sort of the art of the day, wiping out hundreds of acres of urban communities, just as they did with expressways and all kinds of other things that happened in that era, to create these multi-purpose stadiums. And they didn't last a full generation. People, found they were too small for football. They were too large for baseball. The sight lines weren't great. And just the intrusiveness into the urban environment, even if they existed within a city limits, they had no connection to the rest of the city and were doing nothing to fuel the growth and the connectivity within an urban environment. Often not even, often turning a blind eye to transit and how it could have helped make even the pathway more convenient.
That's very interesting to hear your thoughts on, I guess, modernization versus preservation of these aging stadiums. And I want to start talking about Oriole Park, which was your first baseball stadium project that you worked on in your career. And it was completed over 30 years ago, yet it's still held up as the industry gold standard. So I'm just curious if you can speak to like some of the key objectives and considerations in your design process.
Well, I often say that that's a project where the stars really aligned, in that Maryland had a governor who was the former mayor of Baltimore who just loved the city. And he had lost the NFL Colts when they moved to Indianapolis in the mid 80s. And he was desperate to see that the state of Maryland and city of Baltimore would not lose their baseball team. Their basketball team had gone to Washington, so they had gone from being a city with 3 professional franchises to 1. And he was eager to preserve it. And even though they had hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to work with the planning department and looked at some 20 different sites, and there were merits to many of the sites, Governor Schaefer sort of famously said, "I don't care what the report says as long as it says build it in downtown Baltimore." And his intuition was spot on, I think. And how much of this was studied and how much of it was born out of emotion, we'll never know. Because one thing I've learned in my life is that you can run data up the yin yang, but if there isn't emotion and heart in what you do, it often just doesn't happen. But Schaefer's feeling was, look, we've got a downtown that can be home to a traditional workforce. It's back in the days of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We've got a population downtown of some 300,000 people. And we've got the roadway, the infrastructure, the bus system, the metro, the light rail, plenty of parking. And why would we duplicate that somewhere else when it's already here? And baseball is largely an evening and weekend event. So the infrastructure was in place. There was a site on an old rail yard that was light industry, so it wasn't a crazy amount of stuff to move or relocate. And importantly, it redefined downtown. And his instincts were going to drop 3 million people a year into downtown to populate the hotels, the restaurants, and just add to this energy, because on his watch, Schaefer had built the aquarium, the science center, the convention center, the waterfront promenade, many of the ingredients that we see replicated in cities across America, but that have been useful tools for changing a city from a former industrial or financial base into a new economy. The president of the Orioles, Larry Lucchino, really wanted this to be a ballpark, not a stadium. He thought there was a lot of power in the words that were used, so we always called it a ballpark, not a stadium. He had grown up in Pittsburgh with Forbes Field as home of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he knew firsthand how different it was to watch baseball in a more intimate setting. He enjoyed the quirks that go with an asymmetrical outfield, a scoreboard, and a field to play, the uniqueness of baseball that no other sport enjoys, of having different field dimensions. So Larry really wanted a ballpark for the Orioles. Those two agendas were so in sync that it's almost hard to imagine, looking back on it, that they weren't conceived from the same mind, because they had different but complementary objectives that led to the Camden Yards site being chosen, and Larry Lucchino insisting in working with the Maryland Stadium Authority and our architects HOK and planners RTKL that we really make this feel of Baltimore, bought to save the old B&O warehouse, add context, give the asymmetrical playing field a rationale so it's not Disney-esque. And those things, I think, were born out of an authenticity of purpose that makes it something that has stood, I hate to say this test of time, I don't feel that at all, but I do remember when it opened in 92 thinking, golly, how will we know if this will last longer than the place we left? And now it has. So does that mean it's got another 30, 50 years on its future? I guess time will tell.
It sounds like Oriole Park was really the catalyst for downtown revitalization in Baltimore, and it coincided with a lot of the other infrastructure investment that was going into the city.
Well, it was strategic, and that was its goal. And it's interesting that I think we sometimes forget about that even in Baltimore, because you look at it now and the site has filled in around it, and it's maybe not as robust and energetic a retail environment as you might wish, with a large convention center hotel and the extension of the convention center itself anchoring one side. So it doesn't have the finer grain that we might enjoy if we could do it from scratch. But it's still no longer surface parking lots, and that was the whole point, was to redefine it. And people often point to Camden Yards, just as you noted, about it changing the way we thought about sports venues. But I think it changed the way we thought about the development around sports venues and using them as a tool for instigating investment. And 30 years later, you've seen that model exaggerated in a way that it's now part of the formula. Probably most recently, we look at the Atlanta Braves and what they've done in the Battery in Atlanta. You can look at the San Francisco Giants and the Mission Rock development adjacent Oriole Park, or Petco Park in San Diego has the ballpark district around it that's so robust and lively that you forget that it wasn't there until the ballpark itself was created.
Very fascinating. You mentioned about kind of keeping the old warehouse right next to the railway for Oriole Park. Did you have pushback on that decision? Was it hard to convince people to keep a old
It was
warehouse?
controversial at the time. It's hard to believe that now because it's such a signature piece of the ballpark. But again, you have to put yourself in time. Preservation, while not in its infancy, was still not proven. And I think there are many people that would say we still fight to make preservation an important priority in our urban decisions. But the concern that the sort of traditionalist view was that it made the footprint inflexible, and that the ballpark and its asymmetry, something that Larry Lucchino wanted, might not be welcome over time. Was baseball really going to embrace that because the recent parks had not had those kind of quirks to them? And I think there was a genuine concern about cost. Was it going to cost more to save that building than to tear it down? And one of the things that the Stadium Authority made certain that the Orioles worked with HOK to demonstrate was that we could make that it would do the opposite, that it would save money. So we worked to take any program element that did not have to be in the stadium proper, such as the Oriole offices, ushers changing rooms, ticket offices, retail stores, broadcast studios, even the central kitchen, and put those things in the warehouse so that we reduce the footprint of the new structure. And HOK was able to demonstrate that the cost of rehabbing that square footage in the warehouse was cheaper than building new and a new stadium structure. And moreover, aside from the character, it also gave the Maryland Stadium Authority additional space to lease to third parties, all in the goal of keeping an urban environment vibrant and not retreating back to the old days where the ballpark itself wasn't open year round. Even Utah Street, the public street that runs through Camden Yards, is just that, a public street. It was intended to be open and a part of the waterfront promenade in downtown Baltimore, with an idea that the Orioles would put turnstiles on it every game day, make it a part of inside the concourse, so that it really was an active part of the city, even when it wasn't programmed.
It sounds like there was a cost rationale to keep the warehouse, and you were able to free up some of the spaces from the new structure and relocate it into the warehouse, and it just makes sense to keep it.
Yes.
And it has become a very iconic view of Oriole Park. Let's move on to Fenway Park in Boston. So when you first arrived in Boston, Fenway Park was approaching its 100th year anniversary and facing debates about replacement. Can you talk about your vision for preserving and modernizing such an iconic and aging landmark in Boston?
Well, happily, I work for three men who really should be attributed with that vision. I think there were many people, thousands, hundreds, millions, I don't know, who really wanted to see Fenway saved. But and it was frustrating to me during the years that we were working on Camden Yards to hear the Red Sox talk about tearing it down. It was one of the most significant models. One of the things that Larry Lucchino often pointed to was that the two smallest parks in the major leagues, Fenway Park and Wrigley Field, consistently had the highest attendance, no matter whether the team was winning or not, demonstrating, depending on whether you were looking at it through an economist's perspective, that there was a supply-demand thing going on there, that people tended to buy tickets, commit to going, and not wait to see if it was going to sell out, whereas in a 60,000 seat stadium, they're like, oh, there are going to be plenty of seats no matter when I buy. But also, again, Larry's feeling was that there was something to the atmosphere, something to the camaraderie and the intimacy that led people to want to spend their leisure time there. So seeing the Red Sox look back at Camden Yards and say, see, we could build a new version of the old and have a modern thing rather than this old ragged tear down over here was always frustrating to me, because I really felt that there was opportunity that hadn't been tapped. And fortunately, John Henry, Tom Warner, and Larry Lucchino, when they bought the club in 2002, did so with a commitment to themselves to explore every avenue to save Fenway before they pivoted to accepting what the former Red Sox had said, which was that it couldn't be salvaged. And one thing we haven't really talked about, but in my career, I've often moved in and out of real estate and planning and back into sports. And this was a case where the work that I had done outside of sports really paid off for me as well, because much of my work had been with the developers, Bill Streever, who had taken many old industrial buildings in Baltimore and Providence, other places, and converted them into, I guess we would call it adaptive reuse, former industrial buildings, largely on waterfronts that were no longer being used for factory purposes, and turning them into both residential and office. And I had learned about historic tax credits, how to use those, how to work with the National Park Service and the state administrators to modernize a building while still preserving the elements that were historic and thus make it eligible for tax credits. So when I had a chance to work on Fenway, not only did I enjoy the opportunity to look at it, not just through an architectural perspective, but through a real estate perspective, and say, how could we append to this old ballpark some of the buildings that sit adjacent to it? How could we use them to support baseball? How could we use the public streets? We were really fortunate that Mayor Menino was willing to work with us and set his administration, including Commissioner Kazaza and the folks at the Boston Redevelopment Authority, to help us figure out how we could put turnstiles on what was then called Yawkey Way, Jersey Street. I often say it was like life Fenway and Camden Yards are like life imitating art, art imitating life. You know, we'd seen the crowds, we'd loved the energy around Fenway. We tried to reproduce that in Baltimore, and then when that was successful, we tried to reproduce how we had captured it. And I Cairo Shen, who was at the Boston Redevelopment Authority at the time, worked really hard to help us figure out how we could navigate things like putting the seats on top of the Green Monster. And Bronna Simon, who was at the Boston State Massachusetts Preservation, oversaw our work, helped us think through how do we manage the era that we're preserving, what's worth preserving, what can be, quote, modernized. Because one of the things I really love about buildings that are on the National Historic Register is that the whole mission of the National Park Service is to keep the building in use for its intended purpose. And so no one ever said you've got to preserve Fenway as if it were a precious object, because there's an understanding that code has different requirements about exiting. You need more space. You need the food and beverage, the restrooms, the sponsorship opportunities, the premium seating, the press box, the clubhouses. You can go on and on with all these things that take up space that simply couldn't exist in a 1912 or 1934 footprint. So mapping all of that out was a real treat, because even though we talk about it as the preservation of Fenway as if it was an architectural problem to solve, our architects, De Agostino, Izzo, and Quirk would be the first to tell you it was about architecture. It was about real estate. It was about planning. It was about working with the city and their rules, regulations, and the ability to make things work. And I would just say that the neighborhood had a really important role in that too. And the role that, say, Fenway Park and other advocacy organizations played in helping us make certain that the neighborhood understood the impact of saving it versus the impact of tearing it down. And I would say that was much of our energy and success came from their participation too.
And I have to say, you did a fantastic job. I attended my first ever Red Sox game not so long ago, and I was just blown away by like the history of that building. I cannot imagine the challenges the engineering and design team face when you're trying to upgrade a lot of these stadium features while kind of maintaining its retro, like historic look. I think the audience sees the value in preserving.
Yeah. Well, certainly the owners did. And I think that's what I meant by you can make numbers do a lot of things, but somewhere in there you need passion. And I think John Henry and Tom Warner and Larry Lucchino brought a passion for saving that park. And maybe it's a little bit where there's a will, there's a way. But I was delighted to be a part of that team.
Right now, the project really serves as like a cultural landmark in Boston. I want to move on to your experience with Dodgers. So, after your work at Fenway and Oriole Park, can you speak to what drew you to the West Coast?
Well, it was as simple as an invitation. So I love that. I had worked on the conversion of the 1996 Olympic Stadium
Right.
To be the new home for the Braves in Atlanta under Stan Kasten, who was at the time president and CEO of the Atlanta Braves. And he went on to play that role with the Washington Nationals. And then in 2012, when he went to Los Angeles, with Mark Walter and Peter Guber and Magic Johnson and Bobby Patton and all the folks who bought the Dodgers in 2012, he asked me if I would come and be a part of looking at this 1962 stadium and thinking about how to modernize that. And Dodger Stadium is just one of a kind, sort of truly. It's carved into the hillside of Chavez Ravine. It overlooks Elysian Park, one of the largest urban parks in America, in one direction. In the other direction, you're looking straight at the skyline of Los Angeles from an elevated position. So it's at once urban and yet not woven into the urban fabric. It sort of sits divorced from it in this crazy environment. But beyond its outfield pavilions are the San Gabriel Mountains and just nothing but the green of Elysian Park on, the 300-degree, the 360. And as I said, it's 1962, so it had these crazy colors and corrugated metal and funky shapes that only would have come from that period. So our challenge was how to preserve all of that, not change its postcard view, but make it feel very different when you came to watch a game there. And so working with, once again, DAIQ and the Los Angeles-based architect Brenda Levin and landscape architect studio MLA, Mia Lair and her group, we were fortunate to be able to figure out some ideas very different at Dodger Stadium than at Fenway Park, but some ideas to preserve that by building plazas that are appended to the building, putting the kids areas, the new food and beverage, the retail, the hangout spots appended to the outside of the building, and create this incredibly vibrant atmosphere. I'd be the first to say that winning helps, and the fact that the Dodgers have gone into the postseason all 13 years that this ownership group has been there and Stan Kasten has been the president and the CEO is no accident. We'd like to think it's all about the architecture, but we know better. But I love that in a city as large as Los Angeles, in a building that's a capacity of 56,000, and golly, it's 10,000 seats more than almost than the new Yankee Stadium. And the Dodgers' attitude wasn't let's shrink it and try to, look like everybody else. It's like, let's do the opposite. Let's just fill it up. And so we worked really hard to make it feel like home to the multicultural population that lives in Los Angeles. I just love that our signage is in different languages, and our food, our music all reaches out as a real reflection of the city of Los Angeles. And I think it sort of brings me back to something I said earlier, that baseball is just such a wonderful reflection of the culture of the city, and different, I think, from other sports in many ways. It's exaggerated in baseball because the venues are so different. Maybe they have to be, because 81 home games a year is a long season when you're comparing yourself to football with 8.
It sounds like your approach to kind of like picking what to preserve, what to modernize, is really based on feedback of the fan or from the ownership. Can you walk us through, I guess, the process of picking what to preserve and what to upgrade when you're?
That's a really good question. There's a fine line between distinctive features and old dated features. And I think the trick is to figure out what gives it personality and how to celebrate that. And with the same breath, figure out how can you create an environment where people choose to spend their leisure time and disposable income. And so making certain that it feels family friendly, that it feels safe, that the food and beverage is as good as you can buy somewhere else, that the bathrooms are clean and plentiful, the entertainment, the scoreboards, the music are all done in a way that create an environment that attracts not just the diehard fan, but the casual fan. I think is really important. You don't draw 4 million a year as the Dodgers did this year, with all of them carrying scorecards and knowing the lineup as they walk through the gates. You draw 4 million people a year because somebody thought it was a good environment to be in and brought some friends with them.
And was there like a particular feature that you've implemented or maybe upgraded that's your personal favorite or the crowd's favorite?
I think one thing that I would have to point out is something that Stan Kasten would say is that in baseball, the image of the park between the foul poles is really its defining feature. Whether you think about Oriole Park at Camden Yards in Baltimore and the warehouse, whether you think about San Diego and the Western Metals building that's in that ballpark, the McCovey Cove at Oracle Park in San Francisco. Oh golly, I think I could go on and on. The water fountains in Kansas City, the Apple at Citi Field in New York. Every park has some symbol that sort of lives in the outfield. And at Dodger Stadium, it's two things. It's the folded roof of the outfield pavilions and the bullpen sitting facing as the pitcher will when he comes in. And so creating opportunities for fans to really engage in that and be a part of that environment was really important to us. And I've loved being able to lean into that. And I've also loved that the Dodgers have entrusted kind of the whole of our historical assets to my team to figure out how to use them in displays and exhibits and just let the building tell its own story. I think a real historian might come through and be a little cynical about the way we've done some of our things, but it's just been fun to put things like the trunks that the team used to travel from Brooklyn to Vero out on display, and take some of the old signage from the 1970s when the color scheme changed to these primary colors that were in vogue then, and then back again to the 60s colors, and just create a montage of those signs. So it's a joyous place, and I've really loved the breadth of design. I guess that's the right word, from planning down to the exhibits that we've been able to celebrate at Dodger Stadium.
Gosh, it's so nice to hear you describe all these features. Like now I really wanted to visit these baseball parks.
I think baseball is interesting because it's the only sport that I'm aware of where fans literally make a pilgrimage to go to all 30 major league parks. And fans are always comparing which ones are the best, and you always see the top five include some of the ones that we just talked about, but also beautiful PNC Park in Pittsburgh where the Pirates play, and it sits poised on the river with this fantastic view of the Roberto Clemente Bridge, the Andy Warhol Bridge, the Rachel Carson Bridge. So there are things that not only are sort of beautiful and iconic about the ballpark and the city, but just those names and how they resonate through Pittsburgh sort of reminds you of why baseball is America's pastime and how it is so intertwined culturally into the city. And I've loved that the work we've done in recent decades has intertwined it physically into the city as well.
Thank you for that response. I wanted to jump ahead. I want you to talk about the company that you helped co-found, the Canopy team. It's an all-women-led sports design and strategy firm. Can you speak to what inspired you to start your own firm and what sort of design philosophy that you bring from designing baseball parks to real estate development?
Well, I have to credit Stan Kasten for the inspiration behind that, but I think Stan just felt that these were not one-ofs. That we sort of the advantage of getting old and having done this for a long time is that you can see that there's a desire on the part of many teams to create an atmosphere that evokes this kind of emotion. And financial success. I don't want to pretend like that isn't a driver, but I'm a big believer that your financial success follows creating something where fans want to be and want to spend their money. So fans, sponsors, there are a lot of different ways that money comes in. And we had worked on so many projects by the year 2020 when COVID hit. We were just sure that the world was going to end. We found almost the opposite. That once COVID had found its way into the rearview mirror, that we were maybe hungrier than ever as people to be with each other and to be in an environment that was energetic and engaging and exchange the lighthearted banter that comes with sports. And so we took the show on the road, so to speak. And my partner and our CEO, Fran Weld, had spent a large part of her career on very similar projects. We'd worked together on the renovation of the Rose Bowl. We'd worked together at Fenway Park. She had done renovations of the original El Toro Park in Durham, home of the Durham Bulls. And she'd spent the last 12 years of her career overseeing the $3 billion real estate development of Mission Rock at Oriole Park in San Francisco. So together, our portfolio spanned a nice breadth of projects and geography. And so it's been a real treat to work with, we've done some international work with the Paris basketball and their Adidas arena. We've done some work with Chelsea at Stamford Bridge in London. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've loved working with youth sports. We've enjoyed projects. I mentioned the Pirates. That's been one of my personal favorites. And things like working with, just the seemingly simplicity of minor league sports. Maybe, again, my personal favorite being the Oriole Park in Worcester, home of the Worcester Red Sox.
Yes. So this firm is a women-led firm, both yourself and your co-founder. I want to ask you about what are some of the takeaways that you've learned from working in a male-dominated industry. Like I know that baseball, like from the players to the team ownership team, it's just very male-dominated space. So throughout your career, having to navigate these relationships, like what are some of your takeaways from that?
Well, I never really know how to answer a question like that because I've always been a woman and my career, whether it's been through the lens of construction, real estate, architecture, or sports, has largely been male. But I think if you demonstrate a combination of expertise in your field and willingness to be a sponge and learn, that you can navigate through that with grace. And I do think listening is a big part of that. There are aspects of my work. You mentioned the players. I'm not in the clubhouse when they're in the clubhouse, so I really rely on others to describe to me how they use the space and what matters to them. And so there are aspects of the work that I'm not able to touch and feel and see firsthand. But I have good eyes and ears, and I hope out there for me, and I hope I can pay attention to that and compensate for that with the way we think about looking at it through the lens of the way the public does, the way the fans respond to it, the way sponsors respond to it, the way cities respond to it, working with elected officials, neighborhoods. There's nothing gender specific about any of those things.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then another question I have for you is, what's been the biggest disappointment when you're working on a project?
I guess the ones that don't happen. I think when you work on a project and it just never gets off the ground or never gets funded, you can't help but there's some things I just can't unsee. Like, oh my gosh, we could just have saved that building, or we could have just persuaded the city to allow us to develop the land around the park. We could have created an environment that would have preserved the park itself. And so I think it's the ones that got away. Maybe the same thing they say about fishing. It's the ones that got away that are the disappointments. But they're certainly more than offset by the joy of seeing people use the ones that do get completed. And so I guess I try to stay focused on that.
Yeah, just a follow-up question to that. What's been a reoccurring theme that these project doesn't happen? Like, is there a common denominator?
Well, I think sometimes it's an idea is ahead of its time. I would say that about some of the work that I did in the 80s for the redevelopment in downtown Los Angeles. Here, golly, 40 years later, downtown is it's just now sort of becoming what we had imagined then. So I think when you work in urban design and urban planning, one must be patient. It doesn't always happen overnight. So I guess that's just a self-reflection that you have to realize that the enormity of some of the projects that we're working on take a generation to be realized. But it maybe is one reason I've enjoyed some of the renovations so much, because it's so gratifying to plan something, have the season end in October, build it, cut the ribbon in April, and start up again the following year. So the sort of instant gratification of that offsets those that are in the incubator for decades.
Janet, this has been such a treat. We've covered so much ground. From your early days working on Battery Park City to modernizing baseball parks, and now through your work at the Canopy team, what truly comes through in everything you've shared is your deep respect for the place, for its history, community, and the stories that makes each city and stadium unique. You've shown that design isn't about just buildings. It's about creating spaces where people feel connected, whether that's in a neighborhood park or a 50,000-seat stadium. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey with us and for reminding us that great design at its heart is really about the people.
Thank you. I love that summary. Thank you so much.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning into another edition of Meet the Visionaries podcast. And please remember to stay tuned for future episodes by subscribing to our podcast, or follow us on social media by visiting cre.mit.edu to learn more. Until next time, take care, listeners.